Hello everybody, thank you all so much for coming and welcome to the Cambridge Union and to our 10th speaker event of Michaelmas Term. The format of today's event is a speech followed by Q&A, which means that I don't have to do anything, and that is a very good thing. Our guest tonight is Professor A.C Grayling. A.C Grayling is a British philosopher associated in Britain with the new atheism movement, as well as founding and serving as the Master of New College of Humanities. A.C Grayling serves as the Vice President of the British Humanist Association and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. He will speak on Culture and Anarchy Revisited. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming A.C Grayling to the Cambridge Union.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be back in this room. I was here in the Easter vacation for the Cambridge Literary Festival and enjoyed myself then, and as I hope to this evening. So, as you see, I've been asked to revisit Matthew Arnold's idea in Culture and Anarchy about the concept of culture because it underlies a polemical point that I'd like to make in defense of the humanities. Now, you'll all be very familiar with the fact that the great attractor in our contemporary education system, higher education system in particular, and also in our economy really, is the STEM subjects and the vocational subjects, like, for example, business management and accountancy and the like. Because, of course, one of the drivers is that parents of people who go on to higher and further education, however much they love their children, they do want them to leave home eventually and do their own laundry. So it matters to them tremendously that their offspring should get a job of some kind. And they're therefore a bit inclined to say, if the offspring in question say, oh, I'd love to go on and study literature or the classics or philosophy or history, the parents will say, well, what kind of a job is that going to get you? This is rather dismaying response. And the idea that somehow or other technical and vocational subjects are much, much more important and much more likely to get one rich and happy after formal education is over tends to have big influence on the choices people make. And it's certainly true that STEM subjects and vocational subjects are of great importance. There's no question about it. It's necessary indeed in a highly sophisticated and complex world that we live in now, that people should be numerate, should have at very least an intelligent grasp of the developments in the natural sciences and in the vocational subjects that do turn the wheels of our societies and economies now. But even people who have a great talent for the sciences and who want to go on to study them and to make a contribution to them, even they, and this will be an important part of the burden of my argument, even they should continue to retain a passion for what the humanities can offer us. And I will spell out the reason why shortly. But as a kind of preface to that, let's have a look at the context in which and the claims in which the famous collection of essays by Matthew Arnold called Culture and Anarchy consisted. It was a collection of essays published in 1869. Quite an important date in a way, because it relates to one of the big influences on Arnold. Matthew Arnold, as you may know, was a poet, of course, and an essayist of some distinction. He was a person who was, like so many educated people of his day, steeped in the classics. He knew his Greek and he knew his Latin. He wrote wonderfully, really, about Homer and about translating Homer, as you may know. He was the son of the famous Dr. Arnold of Rugby School, the headmaster of Rugby School, whose attitude to things, like attitude of many great Victorians as lampooned by Lytton Strachey, was very, very well summed up in the kind of Tom Brown view of what a schooling should be like, the cognate idea of what used to be called muscular Christianity. This idea that whatever it is that one does in life, it should be for the good. One should make a contribution, and that education was a preparation for doing good in the world. And this was therefore one of the influences on Matthew Arnold, because he certainly agreed with his father that living a life which didn't have as at least part of its aim the making of a net contribution, of adding something to our world, that such a life wouldn't be worth living. So he certainly accepted that from his father. But rather differently, Matthew Arnold was a schools inspector, and among, perhaps almost uniquely, that's a terrible phrase, but you know what I mean, there were very, very, very few people in the Victorian period who had anything like his social and educational background, and at the same time a quite close and detailed knowledge of the children of the working poor and the schools in which they were educated. At the time that he was a schools inspector, the great elementary school movement was really getting underway. Part of the inspiration of it, of course, was the Church of England, who opened lots of primary schools, and part of their motivation for doing it was, you may think with a certain touch of irony, to combat superstition, because after all, people, certainly less educated people at the time, believed much more in fairies than they did in the deity. After all, the deity was only present on Sundays, but fairies and gnomes and other irritating beings were present all the time, curdling your milk and stealing your shoelaces and so on. So what the church wanted to do was to combat superstition, and that was one of their drivers in setting up elementary schools. But it was a movement that was much supported by government in the middle and later 19th century, because as industrialization and technological development grew, so the same familiar impulse lay behind a support in the spread of literacy and numeracy. Governments of the day realized then, as they still say now, that literacy and numeracy are important adjuncts for the economy, that is, effective foot soldiers in the great economic battle. It wasn't, as you see, an idealistic view about the way that an education could fulfill the human life and give it a sense of the wider possibilities of being and a richer ethical conception, ethical rather than moral conception, ethical in the sense of the ethos, the character of individuals who were reflective and informed. That really wasn't the driver. The driver was a practical, a pragmatic, and a Benausic one, as is usually the case with people who invest large sums of money in education, like governments and others. They want a return on investment. But Matthew Arnold was acquainted really quite intimately with the school system of the day, and that was the second influence on his thinking when he devised this series of essays on culture and anarchy. But the third was a particular historical event. In July of 1866, there was a tremendous near riot in Hyde Park in London, associated with the failure of an attempted reform bill, a successor to the Great Reform Bill of 1832, the aim of which was to extend the franchise. Now, one of the curious ironies of political history, anyway, is that you get a liberal Whiggish government like the government of Earl Russell in the mid-1860s trying to extend the franchise. And there was a great popular demand for it, after all, in some of the big cities, and some of the working people who were fully part of the great industrialized new economy wanted to have the vote, wanted to have a say, and they've been campaigning for it. And they've been a very intelligent campaign indeed for a number of years. The Reform League, which had taken over from the Chartist movement, was a very well-organized one. And so a bill was put before Parliament in 1866, and it was defeated by the machinations of no less a person than Benjamin Disraeli, who in the following year introduced and passed a bill which was even more extensive of the franchise than the one that Earl Russell had introduced. So that's one of those strange ironies of politics. But the fate of the franchise is not the point at the moment. The point is that there was a rally organized by the Reform League, and they were going to march to Hyde Park, and the rally was banned by the then Home Secretary. And so to test the limits of suppression of freedom of assembly, the League got together all its marchers, and they marched from Trafalgar Square up to Hyde Park. There they found the police. In those palmy days, Hyde Park was railed off all round. And the great crowds, because been estimated that about 250,000 people, 200,000 people had turned up to this rally. They just simply knocked the railings of Hyde Park over and went into the park, and there were too few police, and the government was too scared, too timid to send in any troops. And this event really unnerved people. It unnerved Matthew Arnold because it seemed to portend anarchy. It seemed to portend the possibility that the populace would rise up against what was a very unequal and a very unjust system and overthrow it. And a lot of thoughtful and reflective people knew then what, alas, we know now, which is that the makers of revolutions very, very rarely inherit the revolutions. Think of recent history in the Middle East. Think of what happened in Tunisia and in Egypt and so on. You get a sort of vanguard of people who are interested in more democratic and liberal institutions and ways, and they initiate a revolution, or they act in ways that precipitate a dramatic change of events. But they aren't the ones who end up holding the reins of power. Other people do, and sometimes they're pretty well the same people, or people who are even worse. Of course, the classic example is the French Revolution and the following Reign of Terror. So the anxiety about anarchy, about society imploding on itself, unless real, genuine concessions were made, genuine reforms were introduced, that was one great anxiety. But Matthew Arnold, being a believer in education, and if you look back across the landscape of intellectual history, you notice how many people have been deeply, deeply invested in the idea that what would save us as a kind, as a species, is education, is getting people to be informed and reflective, really to be able to think a bit about things and to evaluate ideas clearly and to act on them in a principled way. And this is an idea which lay behind, for example, three of the best-known thinkers of the interwar period in the 20th century here in Europe, after the First World War and the frightful destruction and loss of life that had occurred in the First World War. There were many movements inspired by those events to try to remedy human affairs, like the setting up of the League of Nations, for example. But people like Bertrand Russell started a school. Karl Popper became a school teacher. Ludwig Wittgenstein was a particularly unsuccessful school teacher for a while. And all three of them were just exemplars of a movement of people who really believed that it was education and education almost alone that would save the world. Bertrand Russell borrowed his brother's house, Telegraph House down in Surrey, set up a school there. And it so often happens with prep schools, which are very new and very untried, is that they fill up with very difficult, delinquent children who won't be accepted by other schools or are chucked out by other schools. And so consequently, of course, Russell and his wife, Dora Black, had a very difficult time with these children. And some rather famous stories are told about it. Apparently, Telegraph House, or allegedly, Telegraph House was visited by a bishop on one occasion, knocked on the door, and the door was opened by a naked child. And the bishop said, "Good God!" And the child said, "There isn't one." Well, this would have exemplified the approach taken by Bertrand Russell. And you can see that that was not likely to advance the cause of humanity much, but at least they all of them tried. So Arnold was of this kidney. He really believed that it was education that would matter. So influenced by his father's attitudes to education, influenced by the events that had happened just a year or two before, in 1866, the threat of anarchy, the threat of a breakdown of order, he began to reflect a little bit on this great question of how can we rescue civilization? What is it that will enable us to live together in peace and amity as a people and to develop to our very best potential, to become the best that we can be, is the phrase that he used. And his remedy, the solution that he offered, was that we should really seek to extend to every individual the ideal of culture. Now, this word, of course, interestingly enough, at the very, very same time as Matthew Arnold was writing, was being used by a man called Edward Taylor. Some of you here, and the anthropologists among you here, will recognize that name as the father of modern anthropological studies, who had introduced the term culture to denote the way of life, any recognizable pattern of life enjoyed by or possessed by a community. So almost at the same time, I think it was in 1871 that Edward Taylor's book was published. It was a book called, I think, something like A Survey of Primitive Culture. He introduced the word culture to mean something quite different from what Matthew Arnold meant by it. Hence the ambiguity which has remained in the term to our own day. And there was an ambiguity, in fact it's worse, it's a kind of ambiguity in a way, because prior to their time, there had already been a debate about culture, using the term, applying the concept, in a way which limited it very, very much to what aristocrats and wealthy people had access to when they went on their grand tour to look at paintings and learn other languages. It's also true, by the way, that the sort of hidden history of the grand tour in the 18th and 19th century was not only about paintings and languages, but it was also about the sexual education of young men. I remember that the Earl of Shaftesbury sent his son on the grand tour and said in a letter to a friend that he had had a letter of introduction from his son to a certain countess in Paris, who, he said, he hoped would put his son a bit on his haunches by putting him on her haunches. So you can see that there was definitely a hidden agenda. But the idea was that by acquiring some languages, getting to know a bit about art, finding out something about the way other people live, looking at the social, political practices of other societies would provide one with culture. Now, John Bright, you remember Cobden and Bright? John Bright, one of the great liberals of the mid-Victorian period, had been scathing about the idea of the acquisition of culture by leisured mainly young men, of course, who went on the grand tour. And he said, what we mean by culture is just having a smattering of Greek and Latin. And if you have that and you've been on the grand tour, then you're cultured. And he was using the term culture in a way that had been derived from its use embedded in phrases like agriculture and horticulture. In the 18th century, the notion of culture was a kind of transitive verbal notion that what you do was you bred up a certain kind of rose or made your crops grow by putting them in the right kind of refreshed and fertile soil, that you could culture a mind, you could grow a mind by exposing it to art and to literature and to experiences abroad and to other languages and therefore other perspectives. And in that sense of culture, the denotatum of the expression was what we would now mean when we use the term high culture to denote art and opera and ballet and all those things that seem expensive and exclusive. So this phrase, this expression culture, this phrase high culture, and this idea which was being attacked in some quarters in the period up to the time that Arnold wrote, that was the background in part to what he was saying. And so the meaning that he attached to the word culture was different from that, and it was different, of course, from the more general anthropological use of the term culture then being introduced by Edward Taylor. And knowing these things helps us to focus a little bit on what it was that Arnold was after. Now, famously, in the 1871 preface to his collection of essays, Culture and Anarchy, Arnold said, "Culture is the attempt to reach perfection through exposing ourselves to all the best that has been thought and said in our traditions of civilization, in the hope of being able to get us to think freely and freshly about things and to see them as they are." Now, I'm paraphrasing here, that's not an exact quotation from him, but I'm using some of the phrases that he used famously. The quest for perfection, so he's very perfectibilist, he's setting up the ideal of the outcome or terminus of an educational process and the culturating process as being the perfection of the mind, the character of individuals. And his great thought, his great aim was that if everybody could have such an education, if everybody could be exposed to the best that had been thought and said, if everybody came to be capable to think freely and freshly about things and to see them as they are in themselves. And by the way, that idea, of course, as you recognize since you were all reading Lewis Dickinson on the culture of the Greeks, is a very Grecian idea. So the idea that was so distinctive of the Greeks of the classical period, to see things whole and to see them steadily, to see them as they are in themselves, without delusion and without distraction by whatever petty interests people might have. So this was the idea. Now you will notice one thing about it which immediately doesn't really strike a chord with us these days, and that is the idea of perfection. Now, it is one thing to think of knowledge or of the discovery of truth as being ideals of inquiry, as something that we feel ourselves trying to move towards. We would like to know about the truth of things. We would like to make discoveries about how things really are. No self-respecting scientist, indeed no self-respecting intellectual of any kind, would claim that we are as close as we would like to be to the truth about things or to understanding the nature of things. But to see a movement towards or a convergence upon these things as ideals of inquiry is something which is of great importance to us. And indeed, in the 18th century, Voltaire had said, "I will defend with the last drop of my blood anybody who seeks the truth," although I'm not going to think very much of anybody who claims to have it. And this, of course, is an encapsulation, rather wonderful encapsulation of the idea of a process, a progress towards discovery and truth as an ideal. So perhaps we should say, not with Arnold, that what we are seeking is the perfection of human character and human society. That is an idea which has its roots in a number of different kinds of perfectibilist traditions of thought, beautifully lampooned, by the way, by Thomas Love Peacock. For those of you who've been reading Nightmare Abbey and Headlong Hall recently in the Bath, well, then you'll know that he is very funny about perfectibilists. But instead, we would prefer, I think, to substitute the key concept of the Enlightenment of the 18th century, which was not perfectibilist in outlook, but was meliorist. That means which sought to make things better, which sought by incremental endeavor to improve on problems and difficulties in society and in human individual life, bit by bit. Meliorism, making things better. Perfectibilism, trying to reach perfection. And you will all know, those of you who have labored long and hard over an essay on a night before what you call a supervision here for some reason in Cambridge, I speak as an Oxford person where we use all the correct terminology, you will all know that as you labor over an essay, so you would like to produce the perfect, and sometimes it happens that the perfect is the enemy of the good. You produce a good essay, but it isn't quite the essay that you wanted to write. Still, if you were to take the Enlightenment ideal of meliorism, then you wouldn't be all that bothered about it. So we might want to substitute for Arnold's idea of trying to perfect ourselves, the idea of constantly trying to better ourselves, better the circumstances of others whom we might be able to help, and certainly in concert with one another to improve society. And that is the much, much more realistic idea. And indeed, something seen by Voltaire also, because if you were reading Candide recently, you will know that Dr. Pangloss, of course, gets a bit of a hammering in an amusing way in Candide. But when Candide and all his friends end up living in Constantinople, looking after their little garden, what they've settled for is the perfectly reasonable, more modest, and yet more attainable goal of making things better and living a better life. So if we substitute meliorism for perfectibilism in Arnold, then we see this rather handsome ideal. And the handsome ideal is, by getting people to become acquainted with, as he describes it, the best that has been said and thought, then we might be able to encourage people to think freely and freshly and to see things as they are. Now, these are very general remarks, but they capture, I think, something deeply worthwhile. The idea that infuses these phrases of Arnold's, a very, very attractive idea. Think of it, the best that has been said and thought. Well, here, Arnold is implicitly capturing the fact that a civilization, a culture, and its best efforts to make sense of experience, to make sense of what an individual human life is, and what good relationships are, remembering that we are social animals, that we need one another, that we need to give and receive love and to have all the benefits of friendship and to be part of a community and to feel that we make some contribution to the lives of our fellows also, because to be isolated and cut off from others and never to feel that one is of any use to others is a very dreary place to be in one's life. So there, the idea that lies behind Arnold's remark is the idea that the civilizing activities of a society consist in a great conversation that society has with itself about everything that matters, about matters of value, matters of concern. So you can think of the move to introduce people to the benefits and promises, the possibilities that acculturation offers, is getting them to be first auditors and then contributors to that conversation. Auditors of it and then contributors to it. A great conversation of humankind about things that matter. That's what he was trying to describe in saying, as he did, that the best that has been said and thought is what we should get people to become acquainted with, because from it they would acquire this ability to think straight and to think true. And then that second thing, the hope that by being auditors of this great conversation and then equipping ourselves to become parties to it, which we do through the process of education, will allow us to engage with others, to discuss with them how things are and how they might be better, to discuss with one another how we are to live together. And it would, and this is despite the simplicity of that thought, it carries with it something extraordinarily deep and with accoutered, if you like, with a number of very, very important implications. One of which is that it involves the recognition of the diversity and plurality of human nature and human experience. Almost all our fellows in the human story throughout history, and indeed even now today in our world, have been taught to think that there is a sort of one-size-fits-all answer to the question of how we should live, what we should do, what we should aim for, what matters. All the great ideologies, and some ideologies take the form of religions, and some ideologies take the form of great political outlooks. There really is very little difference between any totalizing ideology that wants people to think the same sorts of things about the same subject matters, to get into line, to toe that line, to sign up for some huge corporate project. This is what any major religion will ask of people, that they believe the same, that they behave the same. This is what a great totalizing political ideology, like, let us say, Stalinism or Maoism, will ask of people. But one thing that the thinkers of classical antiquity recognized and had in common with the thinkers of the Enlightenment was this recognition of the diversity of human goods. The fact that good and worthwhile lives really worth living, lives in which a sense of achievement in relationship and in endeavor can exist, are conformable with the great differences there are between people as to their talents and capacities for such lives. Given the tremendous differences between us, we might encounter other people whose choices, whose interests, whose desires and needs are very different from our own. And we may not even fully understand why they have those interests and desires. But so long as their acting on those interests and desires doesn't do harm, this is the great John Stuart Mill harm principle in operation here, we have no right to interfere with their search for fulfilling lives. But the sheer diversity of such possibilities in human experience of itself demands that we be tolerant, and tolerance demands of us that we have some insight into this diversity and into this difference. And it is simply not possible to get that range of insight into how things might differ for other people and how they might feel about things unless we think and read, unless we listen to that conversation that humankind has. There's an important underlying point there. I'd like to quote Plutarch on this point about what it takes to be a party to the conversation of humankind. You may remember in his essay on the dinner of the seven wise men, and I do have to point out, of course, that in antiquity it was the men who went to dinner, but the ladies were doing something much more important probably, which is why they weren't there. But at this beginning of this essay, when Plutarch says, we know the duty of a host at a dinner party, but what is the guest's duty? And his friend says it's to, be a good conversationalist. And then he says, what it is to be a good conversationalist is to be informed, knowledgeable, to have an educated mind and sensibility, but also to be a very good listener, to really hear what other people say, to catch their meaning, as we say in our contemporary colloquial parlance, to know where they're coming from. Because we all know, of course, that the world's problems, and certainly all domestic problems, arise from not actually hearing what people say, but only thinking that we do. That is a very, very fertile source of difficulty in life. But to be attentive and to recognize the points of view and the starting blocks from which people set off, that is quite a skill, and it requires a thoughtful and an educated mind to be able to do it well with insight. So this is the kind of thing that Arnold has in mind, that being party to that conversation is what it is, to have acquired from an acquaintance a familiarity with the best that has been thought and said. And then as a result, it enables us to be able to think with what he describes as freedom and freshness. Freedom because we are not constrained by conventions and traditions and by the prison house of a particular kind of outlook. Freshness because if we never think about how things might be differently and about how other people see things differently, then of course we run in the ruts of those conventions and traditions, and we never challenge our assumptions, we never dig down into the framework of our thinking about things, so that we can rethink them, so that we can test the basis on which we believe and act as we do. Sometimes, of course, we will find out that our assumptions are okay, stand up to scrutiny, and alas, quite often we'll find that they don't. And when we find that they don't, it's a kind of duty of intellectual integrity to revise those assumptions and to find better bases on which to believe and act. And so that idea, the idea of being able to think freely and freshly in Arnold, is a very significant outcome of the process of getting the education which consists in the exposure to the best that has been thought and said. So that is the theme, and those of you who've read Arnold's essay will know that he apportioned the population of 1868 Britain into three classes. The barbarians, who were the landowners and wealthy. The Philistines, who were the middle classes, interested only in making money. And the populace, that is the mass of people, disenfranchised, given very little access to any of the levers of influence or power in society, and on the whole, anyway, kept away from the opportunities that education provided. So the barbarians, the Philistines, and the populace. And what he wanted was, he wanted everybody from all three arenas of society to have the opportunity of the kind of education that he thought would produce the cultured person. Not the person of high culture who knew a very great deal about Titian and Rubens necessarily, and only about that, but the person who had read and thought about all the great matters that the more civilized aspects of our history, our forebears, had addressed, had read history, had read philosophy, had been thoughtful, attentive, careful readers of literature, of poetry, and from them had acquired this way of thinking with clarity and thinking with freedom and freshness. Everybody, he wanted all people in society to do it. He was a great democrat with a small d in that sense. He wanted education to be universal, to be general. He wanted everybody to have that opportunity because he believed that if everybody did have that opportunity, that society would be transformed thereby. And that the risk of anarchy, the risk of social breakdown, which arises out of divisions and resentments of the kind that resulted in the assault on the railings of Hyde Park in 1866, just simply wouldn't happen. Now, he was very prescient in this matter, perhaps not prescient is not the right word, maybe just very astute, because he recognized that the more divided a society is, the less comfortable a society it is, and the more at risk it is of disruption and unrest. We see in the advanced economies of the world today, the rich-poor divide increasing, becoming wider and wider, and as it does so the risk of social unrest and difficulty increases. The more equitable a society is, I don't say equal, I say equitable because that word means fair, the fairer a society is, the less injustice there is in society, then the more that society can live with itself. And that was the aim that he had. So the kernel of K.E.R., kernel of his argument is the great and civilizing influence of education. And education, not merely a training in technicality and in vocational matters, but an education, that is a culturing of the mind, an enhancing, enriching, and broadening of the mind that would provide people with this opportunity to think freely and freshly. And what did he think provided that? Well, par excellence, he thought the humanities. And this is where my polemical point about the humanities comes alive. Just before I launch into it, I want to push back on what John Bright had to say about the classics. Remember, scathingly he said, oh, people, we regard as cultured people who know a bit of Latin and a bit of Greek. And this is a very bad mistake on his part, actually, because if you think about what the study of the classics involves, and this will be music to the ears of the classicists in this room, what the study of the classics involves is exposure to the history, the poetry, the philosophy of ancient times, of great empires, the Roman Empire, of some of the most perceptive and astute thinking about the nature of society and human individuality. It's to read about statesmen, about great wars and battles, about the running of an empire. In fact, the study of the classics is a very, very thorough study in how to run things and how to make some sense of human nature and human aspiration. This is why it is that these ancient universities of ours, Cambridge and my Oxford, could educate people in the classics and then send them out to run bits of Burma and India and so on. And that was because they had actually quite an exposure to some of the things that would prove of use to them in the process of doing so. So the classics are, in their way, a kind of paradigm of the humanities, because they brought together history and philosophy and literature and thinking about the application of some of the best ideas in those fields to matters of practicality. So it would be a very bad mistake to diss the classics in the way that John Bright did without really knowing what they involve. So I mention that just in passing because it does cheer classicists up. And there are many other reasons indeed why some familiarity with at least one of the classical tongues is a great help. And just think, if we still had, as we had when I was at school, a requirement for, at very, very least, GCSE Latin as an essential requirement for going to university, no matter what you were going to study at university, then people who are now sort of under the age of, let's say, 21, are sometimes inclined not to know when to use who and when to use whom. Now, that's not possible if you know about the dative and ablative in Latin. Okay, so what about the humanities in general, if you think of them now? Well, I gave as examples of the central humanities the study of literature, the study of history, the study of philosophy, classics itself, the study of modern languages. Those aspects of the social sciences, like geography and law and economics, sociology, anthropology, which bear on the same set of questions or the same fundamental question that the humanities address. Because if you take several steps back and you just look at what this great conversation which the humanities is, what it is that it relates to, what it is an attempted answer to, you see that it is an attempted answer to the Socratic question. Remember, Socrates used to go around Athens and challenge his fellow Athenians with the question, what sort of people should we be? How should we live? What values should shape and color our lives? What kind of society could we construct in which people could be friends and could live in a way that felt worthwhile and good and flourishing for them? We know that this was, we know that this was the Socratic question. You may remember that Socrates himself, although we see him through the slightly distorting lens of the earlier Platonic dialogues, he becomes a mere mouthpiece later on for that frightful old fascist, Plato. But in the early dialogues of Plato, we see Socrates explicitly as well as implicitly telling people that the kind of life that is really worth living is the considered life. the life thought about, the life chosen. He put it, of course, famously in the negative. He said, the unconsidered life is not worth living, meaning that it isn't your life. Your life is the life of football being kicked around by other people in directions that they want the ball to go in. So to choose your life, to have an aim, a goal, and to be in charge of your life is what it is to be living the good life, according to Socrates. You look at the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle, and you look at the great tradition of Stoicism, Stoic ethics, especially the Stoic ethics of late antiquity in the hands of people like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, but also in the letter writers, Seneca and others, and the influence on people like Cicero, although he wasn't a paid-up, card-carrying Stoic himself, but nevertheless he was very influenced, of course, by Stoic debates. And you see, for nearly 1,000 years among educated people, this was the outlook of the educated mind. And you see there the influence of this Socratic challenge and the attempt to answer it. And a very, very great deal of the thinking about history and the literature of the time and the premises, the hidden premises of some of the great poetry of the time, in Virgil, for example, comes out of this idea that the individual and the choices that an individual makes and the contribution that an individual makes to society and the kinds of relationships which are best and most flourishing. Of course, in the classical and Hellenic periods, this was shaped a great deal by Aristotle's conception of friendship. Remember, in the Nicomachean Ethics, he devotes 2 entire books to the question of friendship. But these were the parameters, these were the structural features of thinking about the nature of the good life. And in every case, the unspoken assumption was that a reflective life is an informed life, that is to say, an educated life. And you will remember that a dominant view about the nature of education in antiquity, influenced greatly by Plato's own sort of the descendants of the doctrine of anamnesis, the idea that there is much that is implicit in us that can be brought out, is the idea of the development or evolution of character traits to their highest and their best possibility, which is precisely, of course, what Arnold was talking about. So now, if we fast forward to our own day, and we think about the humanities, we think about the study of literature, the study of history, and the engagement in philosophical discussion, and being able to see through the lens of another language or another tradition, and being able to reflect on the nature of society and some of the reasons why it has the nature it does, the form it does. To be able to do these things is precisely what it is, to get the best and most considered view of these things, and therefore to be able to live in ways that are much more conformable with how things are, see how, have a better view of how they are in themselves. But above all, these pursuits, knowing some history, reading with care and thoughtfulness the literature of our own language and the literatures of other languages if we have access to them, and the engagement in philosophical reflection is about us as individuals also. Now you think about how, well, let me give you just an example from literature, since you were busy in the bath last night. I can see you were all reading Proust there as well, so you may remember there's an anecdote in Proust about one of the characters who, as a little boy, was taken by his nanny, his governess, to play in the Champs-Élysées. And you remember that he reports having hated it. He loathed being taken to play in the Champs-Élysées, a great big wide road, lots of traffic, dusty trees, and he didn't like it at all. And then he said, if only I'd known at that time, all those stories about the lovers who had strolled up and down under those trees, or the people who had wept with grief on the benches there, or the riots and revolutions that had taken place in the Champs-Élysées, or the executions which have happened in Concorde at the bottom of the Champs-Élysées. If only I'd known this, then the place would have come alive. It would come suddenly pullulated with meanings and stories. It would have become a rich theatre for my imagination to work on. Now that idea, the idea that a street in a big city could come alive when you know the history and the stories, you know in which novels or poems there had been mention of it, or a character in a play had been said to walk down it, or something that had happened in history had happened right there where you might be yourself walking. That is to bring to bring the world alive in the most extraordinary and wonderful way. And that, of course, is precisely what a knowledge of literature and history and philosophy and languages does for you. It brings the world alive. It suddenly peoples it with all its meanings, with the layers and layers and layers of the informing past that makes sense so much of what we are and what our world is like now. And this is precisely an Arnoldian point. It's precisely the point of why it matters that we should know these things. So I often ask people to imagine what it would be like to live in a society which doesn't care about history and literature and philosophy. And alas, so many of our societies today seem to be moving all too rapidly in that direction. In Spain, they're abolishing the study of philosophy in schools. Here, there is no public funding going to the teaching of the humanities in our universities. All the funding of humanities in universities comes from cross-subsidy, from capitation fees and from research grants and so on. So, it's not implausible to think that we might turn into a thoroughly technophiliac and Benausic society where it's just left up to people's chance interests that they might know something about history or engage in philosophical discussion. I used to give a talk, an invited talk, when I went around talking to student societies at university under the title, Reading Novels in the Morning. I mean, even today, even among you, a lot of you here, I should wonder that the very concept of reading novels in the morning, unless you're doing a literature course, let us say, seems a bit iffy. Surely you do serious things in the morning on most of the afternoon. You only start reading novels after tea or on holiday. Certainly among older generations, the idea of doing anything so trivial as reading a novel in the morning would seem anathema. And yet, of course, literature is our greatest, deepest, broadest resource for reflection on human variety and the things that matter. It is our most powerful philosophical resource. So people who don't read and read reflectively and thoughtfully are losing out on opportunity to learn a huge amount about human nature and the human condition. And certainly people who don't know about history, well, you remember what G.K. Chesterton said? Those who know no history don't understand the present. You have such a narrow, shallow, limited view of how things are now if you have no sense of how they got to be so. And finally, as I said earlier, the great invitation, the great challenge of philosophy is to examine our assumptions. And when we do that and we find that some of the reasons why we act as we do, individually and as a society, simply don't stand up to scrutiny. I want to give you one example, just one example of that. Why is it that for most of history, and in far too many countries today in the world, homosexuality is regarded with abhorrence and is treated as a crime? Today, people in Iran are being hanged from cranes in the public square for homosexual activity. Yet in our own society, in living memory, I mean in my memory when I was a kid, homosexual acts were treated as crimes and people were imprisoned because of them. Alan Turing, son of this great institution, was driven to suicide by the fact that he was gay, and he'd been arrested and put on trial a couple of times, been offered chemical castration. What a dreadful thing. And yet now gay people can marry in our society. So there have been, in the last half century or so, a wonderful civilizing flip in the way that we view these things. But you ask yourself the question, what is the assumption that lies behind vilification and criminalization of homosexual affections? And the answer is this, or partly the answer, because of course everything is overdetermined, as you know, everything has more than one cause. But one of the major reasons for it is this. That the early Jewish peoples were a herding society. And the goats and the sheep mattered to them. They were existentially important to their society. The increase of the flocks of sheep and goats was of huge importance for clothing, for milk, for meat, absolutely existentially important. And therefore, the seed of the male had to go to the egg of the female to produce the increase of the flocks. And this idea of the fundamental importance, the sacred importance of the seed of the male going to the egg of the female dominated all thinking about sexual and reproductive activity. Read the Old Testament, there you see the patriarchs and the great figures. Solomon, after all, had 1,000 concubines. It was perfectly okay if you were a bloke to have any number of wives and slave girls and children by all sorts of people. That was okay. Not okay if you were female to misbehave yourself, but you could as a man. So adultery, fornication, these things didn't matter at all. But any kind of sexual activity which couldn't result, which was not directed towards the possibility of pregnancy, was outlawed. So Onan, you may remember in Genesis, in chapter wherever it is, 38 or so, and he was instructed by his father Judah to raise up children to his brother's name, since Tamar had been left without children when she was widowed the first time. Refused to do it, and he spilled his seed on the ground, we're told in Genesis, and was instantly struck down by the deity who doesn't like that kind of thing. So there we get a really palpable message that sexual activity must be reproductive activity and can't be anything else. Hence it says in Leviticus, it is an abomination for a man to lie with another man as with a woman. And that has coloured and dominated thinking about the legitimacy of sexual activity for century after century, indeed millennia, to the great hurt of many, many people. Indeed, at one point in the moral theology of the church before the Reformation, masturbation was regarded as worse than rape, because rape can result in pregnancy. And that kind of twisted thinking is the outcome of assumptions which need to be exposed and challenged. We need to understand where ideas and practices come from. So if we imagine a society that never looks at its assumptions, never engages in, never asks the question, why? Why do we think this? What's the basis for this view and this practice in our society? If that never happens, that society is going to be stuck like a dead thing, running along the ruts of those traditions and conventions that I mentioned earlier. And it was precisely that Arnold had in mind when he used the phrase to think freely and freshly about things. And you can only think really freely and really freshly, and therefore to see things as they are, if you fully engage in that conversation, listening to it and then taking part in it, that great conversation which consists in the acculturation of mind. So today, in our contemporary world, in our contemporary society, the fact that so many people are discouraged from going on to study the humanities or to recognize the importance of them, don't have to study them if you're going to go and study physics or biochemistry or something, but to keep on reading, keep on thinking and discussing. The fact that we think of these things almost as if they were leisure activities. But the great point that Arnold was making is that they're not marginal. They're not incidental. They are of the essence, absolutely at the center of the possibility of making better lives and better societies. That is my sermon on the importance of the humanities. Thank you very much. Well, I'm very happy to take any questions, comments, or complaints. And while you're formulating them, any of the three, I might just mention a very kind introduction. Pointed out that I'm the master of the new College of the Humanities in London. And one of the motivations for setting up a college dedicated to the study of the humanities is this. We have a number of institutions in the UK, like, for example, the Imperial College, a great institution, Brunel University, Cambridge, of course, with its tremendous tradition of study in the sciences and engineering and medicine. We have a number of institutions in our country dedicated to the advancement of the sciences and the technical subjects. And now with the Francis Crick Institute coming on stream very soon, being built at the moment in London, and the biological sciences, the biological sciences, of course, are of absolutely life, society and world transforming importance given stem cell research and the impacts on medicine generally. We have a number of really major and outstanding institutions dedicated to science and technology. We don't have any until the formation of the new College of the Humanities, which are standalone, dedicated to the study of the humanities. And it seemed to me, when I started this enterprise, to be of importance. That was one of the reasons, but it seemed to me a very, very important reason. And when I thought about it, and I thought about why we should have a college where what people were doing was pursuing the Arnoldian dream, modified from perfectibilism to meliorism, when I thought about that, I had two great things in my favor. One was enthusiasm for the idea, and the other was complete ignorance about how to carry it out. And I can tell you that those two things, enthusiasm and ignorance, are very powerful helpmates. So, any question, comment, or complaint? Yes?
Hello, yes. I just had a question about what you were saying to Plato's theory of Humanities and how that relates to Arnold and his whole belief in thinking freely. Because, and this is just my benefit, probably just not a problem,
Yeah.
but if Anamnesis is literally the process of recollection, as Socrates' example, teaching geometry
The slave boy.
then wouldn't that be an example of an unconsidered life, in that education in that context is just probing for rediscovery rather than encouraging feelings of original?
Yes, I think you're right about that. It's a very good point. And it's a very un-Socratic point, actually, that Plato is insisting on there, in thinking that we must, in our pre-existence, our disembodied state, have complete and unfettered acquaintance with the forms, immutable, perfect, and so on. No, I don't think that there is a connection between anamnesis and Arnold. Arnold's view is predicated, without it being explicit, on the plasticity of mind, the fact that we can profit from education, not that education is just the unfolding of things implicit. In fact, I rather think that probably in the Anglophone debate about these matters, Locke's argument in Book 1 of the essay concerning human understanding against innate ideas had really demolished the pretensions of the Platonists, even indeed the Cambridge Platonists as they were in the 17th century, trying to revive some aspect of the view that there are things about our minds which have in them implicit knowledge, and propositional knowledge of mathematics, logical axioms, ethical principles, and knowledge of the deity. These were commitments of the Cambridge Platonists of the 17th century. But I don't think there has been, unless you think that genetics is offering us a different kind of innatism, but I don't think that genetic innatism offers us propositional knowledge, just capacities. Yes?
I was wondering perhaps if you think perhaps
Sorry, I'm not very good at making my questions clear, but I was wondering perhaps if you think meliorism, in a sense, assumes is it perfectism? I don't know.
Perfectibilism.
That one. If, as a basis, it almost uses that because meliorism is almost trying to make better towards an aim.
I think there's a very important difference, both semantically and, much more importantly, practically, between the idea that to make things better, you have to have some idealized conception of the best or of a target, an end goal, and the belief that such an end goal is practically attainable. Perfectibilists are people who think that perfection can be attained and ought to be attained. And in fact, it might be one rather unhelpful consequence of being a perfectibilist that if you never reach perfection, you regard anything less as being not worthwhile. Whereas what the meliorist argues is, let us try to make things better. We have a conception of how they might be. We even maybe have this idealized conception of some end state where everything would be perfect. Although, of course, I think people have a sneaking suspicion that if ever they did become perfect, they would be jolly boring. But the idea is that we are so far from any idealized state of perfection that meliorism is more or less an indefinite process. But you don't have to, I think this is a great mistake. I mean, I have, some of you may have heard of John Gray, with whom I have constant battles because he's got such crazy ideas about things. And one of them is that he thinks that the Enlightenment project is a project of perfectibilism, which it manifestly isn't. It manifestly isn't. It's the idea that we can see the better. As Aristotle points out in connection with weakness of will, we do the worst, mainly. But we can see the better, and it behoves us to try to do better in whatever sphere we find ourselves actors or agents. And that's a very healthy view, and it's pretty much really what if you wanted to turn Arnold's prescriptions for a society which is just and fair, a society of thoughtful people who therefore will live together better, that I think is the aim that would help us realize such a society. Yeah.
Thanks. So I'm currently training to be a religious education teacher, which is one of the things you can always end up doing with a philosophy degree. And it ought to be kind of one of those places on the syllabus exactly to defend that kind of mix of history, religious literacy, history of ideas, philosophy, that you think is so important. But it's kind of held back from that sometimes. As you know, like, they wouldn't put humanism on the religious curriculum because it was a worldview, not a religion. So it doesn't entirely seem fit for that purpose in a number of ways. And I was wondering if you had any ideas about what you think religious education in schools should look like and what you thought its purpose was.
Okay. Well, I think there shouldn't be religious education in schools. I think there should be history of ideas, of which the religious traditions would be part. And that if we had the philosophical traditions, the ancient mythologies, the philosophical traditions, the emerging religious traditions, the young religions like Christianity and Islam, which are very uncharacteristic of religious observance and belief beforehand, the rise of science, if we saw the whole thing as one great adventure, one great conversation, again, to use that phrase, then we would see them all in context and in relation to one another. I think it is very distorting to strip out one, to fill it out, just one strand, which is, to talk about the history and nature of the religions, leaving aside all the context. And it really is a bad mistake. It's a bad mistake because if you don't see the religions in the context of other ways of thinking about things, then they come to have an undue significance, an undue importance in people's view of things. It's certainly very important that people should know about the religions, but they should know about them in context. That's my view. However, there's also a movement, there's the PEP movement, Philosophy and Education Project, which is all about trying to keep, firstly to have a GCSE in philosophy and to preserve philosophy proper at the A level, because so-called philosophy and ethics, really philosophy of religion and ethics, doesn't really touch enough on philosophy, and it's becoming much more a religious studies subject than it is a philosophy subject, which is a great pity, it seems to me. And by the way, there is an organization which, if you're going to go on to teach these subjects that you find of use, is called the Philosophy Foundation. And they do these wonderful things. They visit schools, but they also have a great list of publications, which introduces philosophy and philosophical styles of thinking right from the age of 6 onwards. So, for example, to 6-year-olds, they take a ring donut and they ask the kids, what happens to the hole when you've eaten the donut? That's a very good question. Yeah.
As a product of liberal arts institutions and education, I'm very much sympathetic to your comments and to very much proponent of the belief that liberal arts education kind of prepares you for anything that comes on afterwards. Though I must say, as I've seen it, the challenge of it in our society, at least in the United States, I imagine similar here, is twofold. One is the hyper-specialization of society across the board. I mean, even in academia, you see the titles of dissertations these days are the most specific thing, regardless of what subject you're in. And then related to that, a certain reluctance on behalf of employers to hire people who don't have necessarily hard skills. And if you're studying English or classics or literature at a university like Cambridge, we have a certain luxury of being able to kind of get our foot through the door in that capacity. But if someone's doing that at the University of Oklahoma or whatever kind of random other school, it's a little bit more challenging. So I guess kind of bringing it down to the day-to-day level, I mean, what are students who are committed to this worldview, what are they supposed to do in order, if they're not necessarily going to go on to be academics or writers or they want a vocation? What should their pitch be, and what can, I guess, the corporate world or whoever would be employing them do to kind of shift their worldview?
Well, 2 important points to what you say there. One relates to the system in the States, liberal arts colleges. specialization at graduate schools, some wonderful graduate schools at American research universities, of course. And some of the liberal arts colleges like Swarthmore and Amherst and places like that are superb. So in the junior and senior years, when you begin to specialize a little bit, you already have, as a result of your freshman and sophomore experience, a really good basis where you can bring together a lot of influences. So I'm a big fan of that. And actually at my own institution, we have the one subject or two subject honours degree of the standard kind, but we put it into a framework of liberal arts studies so that the undergraduates have a sense of connectedness. So I'm very much with you on that one. I'm slightly less with you on the other point, if I may say, because when you think about the advanced economies of the world, they are mainly service economies. If you think about the kinds of jobs that are on offer in financial services and the civil service or politics or journalism or law or publishing, creative industries, marketing, advertising, a humanities background is a very great advantage. Now, I remember having dinner with a friend of mine in Hong Kong who is the CEO of a very, very big multinational which has its headquarters there. It's a company that made its money in the 19th century by smuggling drugs into China. It's now very respectable. And he told me that he always and only employs humanities graduates. He likes people who study literature and history and classics and so on, because he says, I can tell them in 3 or 4 days what we do here. But as they go up through the ranks and take on different roles in the institution, what I want them to have a sense of is our human reality. Because he made a very, very good point. He said, in our human universe, everything that happens as the result of some human individual saying yes or no. And so to have a sense of what people value, what matters to people, what motivates them, what kinds of influences might enter their reasoning, because despite what the economists used to think, we're not rational agents, and there are so many different influences on us, and therefore to have some textured sense of what human reality is really like seemed to him to be very important. And by sheer coincidence, I'd not long been back from Hong Kong on that visit when I went to give a talk at Imperial College. And the Pro-Viceroy, you know, Imperial College is a great institution for natural science and engineering and medicine. And taken to dinner by the Pro-Vice-Chancellor, who said, and this is a few years ago now, she said the problem was a few years ago, the problem that they were having at Imperial was that their graduates, even some of their very best graduates, were not getting their first choice jobs. And so they went and spoke to the employers and they said, why is this? And the employers said, well, your guys are terrific. I mean, they've come out so good at their specialism, but all they've got is their specialism. And in 5 or 10 years' time, we're going to want some of these people to go into management. And if they don't know anything else, they're of less use to us. And for that reason, Imperial College introduced the co-curriculum, that is the strand of humanities studies that they offer their undergraduates alongside their main degree. And that, to me, is a very speaking fact. Great institution like Imperial recognizing the significance of the requirement for this. Now I say when I go and talk at sixth forms and so on, I say to people, look, you know, your parents are going to say to you what I said at the beginning of this talk, do something that will get you a job. But as a matter of fact, just going to university, spending some time thinking, reading, talking to other people, hearing different ideas, having a bit of opportunity to mature a little. You know, I point out to people that Aristotle studied with Plato for 20 years, which in my view is about the right length of time for an undergraduate course, but, you know, the practicalities these days being what they are. So you now get people saying, well, we should have 2-year degrees. You know, people can do all 12 modules in 2 years. That seems to me to be a disaster because it gives no time for people to reflect a little bit and to join up some of those dots. So we should see the value of the process of education irrespective of its content, but then add the question of the process to the kind of content that we could invite people to contemplate. And we think that we have a chance of sending people out into the world to continue their education, to continue their reading and reflection, to learn yet more but better because of their encounters with people, informed encounters because of what they've read and thought and discussed. And that is, it seems to me, what the tremendous value of a humanities education offers. Anybody else?
wondering, because you're talking about the humanities, what you think the role of science in this opinion of the world that you form via the humanities has?
Well, I think it's very, very important. Perhaps the most economical way to explain this is to say that at my college, which, as I say, is a dedicated college for the study of the humanities, we require of our undergraduates that they do a science literacy program. That's one of the things they have to do. And in order to make this work, because if you have a required course, you know, when you're doing a liberal arts program, you might have to select from a different group of subjects, and then if you're not really interested in science, or you think it's going to be too hard, or you're no good at maths, or you don't like being in laboratories because they smell, or whatever it might be, you end up not taking it seriously. Well, we require our undergraduates to take it very seriously. It's a compulsory component of what they do. And in order to make it work, because it's not going to work on the basis of their knowing enough maths, really, to get a deep insight, and they're not going to have a chance to get to work in a lab and see from hands-on point of view what it's like to do science. So we get people in, I've got a set of sort of visiting profs who come in knowing their subject tremendously well, being very enthusiastic about it, and being terrific communicators about it. So they can really make people see what it's about. That's where I think this idea of an intelligent understanding of these things comes from. So, for example, some of these names might be familiar to you. I have Lawrence Krauss, who comes in to talk about cosmology. Tejinder Verdi, who was one of the leads on the compact muon solenoid experiment at CERN on the Large Hadron Collider, comes in to talk about particle physics and recent work on the Higgs. I've got Richard Dawkins, who comes in to talk about evolutionary biology. Steve Pinker comes in to talk about psycholinguistics and so on. These areas of science are really, really important. And if you have people who can communicate them and communicate their enthusiasm for them, then you have a chance of your listeners anyway getting a sort of an intelligent ability to make sense of an article about it in The Guardian or a newspaper, or read the New Scientist magazine, or read, Nature, and just make a bit of sense out of what's going on, because it's so central to our world. And I don't for 1 minute want to devalue the importance of the sciences or of science literacy, of closing that CP Snow gap, between science and the humanities. That really is crucial. But the great trend in our educational system over the last few decades has been so forcefully in the direction of STEM and vocational subjects at the expense of the humanities that I think it's a mistake to neglect the deep importance of the humanities to our culture.
Over time. Your taxi's here for you.
Thank you so much, everybody.